Transactions. A transaction is a set of operations that act as a single unit, meaning it's either all of these operations are successful or all of them fail. If one of these operations fail, the entire transaction fails and all of it is rolled back. Imagine this situation. We have a transfer, a money transfer from bank A to bank B. If the deposit in bank B fails, if the credit in bank B fails, we need the debit on bank A to fail as well. Otherwise, it's going to be a problem. So a transaction, the reason we have transactions, it's a safety measure. This is one of the reasons we have transactions. Now let's look at an example from Salesforce. Imagine you have a flow where you are getting an account to retrieve some information that we are going to use in an email template. And then we are performing an update on a contact record. Let's say that we have a custom field called email sent. That's a checkbox. We want to check this box to true. When we check that box to true, that might trigger another record triggered flow. And then we are going to send an email with that information. All of this logic is part of one transaction. Get account is part of the transaction. Update contact is part of the transaction. The record triggered flow that was triggered because of this email sent is part of the same transaction, and the send email is part of the same transaction. So all of these things are part of one transaction. And if one of them fails, all of these are going to fail, and then all of this is going to be rolled back. When does a transaction start? It would start whenever, if you are using a screen flow and you add it to a quick action or a button, whenever you click that button, that's when it starts. But then when does it end? If you have a screen flow, a transaction ends with every screen. So if you need to end the transaction for whatever reason, we'll talk about reasons in a second. If you need to end the transaction, you add a screen, it ends the transaction and starts a new one. So if you have a screen flow with 10 screens, you have 10 transactions there. Another way that's less common, and you might get used to using it after you're comfortable with using a third-party add-ons or plugins, is invocable method. And this is basically if you have an Apex class in which there is a method that you call from a flow, then that method could end the transaction and start a new one. If you are using a record triggered flow, you could start a new transaction by adding a synchronous path or a scheduled path. We'll talk about the record triggered flows paths in an upcoming video. For now, let's just remember that we could start a new transaction in a record triggered flow. And I want to call out that subflows do not start a new transaction. If you have a subflow in a screen flow or in a record triggered flow, it's simply part of the transaction. It does not start a new one. There are a few situations when you would need to use to separate transactions. It's less common, but it might happen. One is a mixed DML, and this is an error that might happen, that would happen if you try to create or update a setup and a non-setup record or object in the same transaction. An example is if you try to create a contact and a user in the same transaction, it's going to fail. It's a limitation that Salesforce put in place. I don't exactly know the reason, but if you were to create a contact and you need to create a user, you need to end the transaction after creating the contact first, and then create the user in a second transaction. So if you're using a screen flow, use a screen after you create the contact, and then create the user after that screen, separating these transactions. Another example, which is specific to Nonprofit Success Pack, MPSP automatically creates a household whenever you create a contact. So if you have a flow in which you create a contact and then you need the information from the household, like the household record ID, account ID, then you have to end the transaction after you create the contact in order to have access to the record ID of the household. And you would do that if you, again, if you're in a screen flow, you add a screen, it ends the transaction, MPSP gets triggered to create the household, and then you query that household. Now you have that household information. You might be approaching governor limits. Let's say that you are at 90 SOQL queries, and you need to reset the limits. Then you might want to start a new transaction. This is, I have not used that before. The last thing is if you want to communicate with an external system. You have some logic that's related to the current system, and then you have some logic that goes to another system to grab some information. Then you want the logic that's related to the current system, that we don't want the user to wait to be in one transaction, and then you need that other logic that goes to the external system to be in a separate transaction.